Jimmy Durante reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, his gravelly voice, the same voice that had closed thousands of broadcasts with the same 6 mysterious words for over 3 decades, suddenly and completely unsteady. A tremor that several people present later described as genuinely startling, precisely because it stood in such stark contrast to the boundless comedic confidence that had defined every one of his countless previous broadcast appearances. It was March 8, 1972, 11:44 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man whose signature farewell had become one of the most enduring and most genuinely unsolved mysteries in the history of American broadcasting was about to answer a question that millions of Americans had been asking for over 30 years. Coming up, exactly who Mrs. Calabash actually was, the specific reason Jimmy Durante had protected her identity for over 3 decades, and what happened when Johnny Carson asked him the one question every American had wanted answered since the 1940s. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night. Because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that America's most beloved comedic performer had been closing every single broadcast of his career with a message meant for exactly one person, a woman who had been gone for nearly 3 decades. James Francis Durante was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1893, and by the time he became one of the most beloved and most recognizable entertainers in American broadcasting, his career had spanned vaudeville, Broadway, film, radio, and television, a remarkable range that reflected both his genuine versatility and his specific and enduring appeal to American audiences across multiple generations, a career that would ultimately span nearly 6 decades of continuous public performance across every major format American entertainment produced during that extraordinary period. His distinctive gravelly voice and his equally distinctive prominent nose, which he affectionately referred to as the schnossola, became instantly recognizable trademarks that audiences across the entire country could identify within seconds of any broadcast. But perhaps no single element of his extensive career generated more genuine public fascination than the specific closing line he began using at the end of his radio broadcasts in the 1940s and continued using across the following decades in every subsequent broadcast appearance, a phrase that became, in itself, one of the most enduring mysteries in the entire history of American popular entertainment. Durante would close his broadcasts with the words, "Goodnight, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are," a farewell that immediately generated enormous public curiosity given that no such person appeared anywhere in his professional or publicly known personal life. The specific timing and consistency of this farewell deserve fuller documentation because they illustrate exactly how significant this phrase became within American popular culture across the following decades. Durante began using the phrase in the early 1940s and continued using it without exception. At the conclusion of literally every subsequent broadcast appearance for the remainder of his extensive career, a consistency that meant the phrase eventually reached, by conservative estimates from broadcasting historians, several thousand individual broadcasts across radio, television, and various special appearances. This remarkable consistency transformed what might otherwise have been dismissed as a simple running joke into something audiences experienced as genuinely significant, understanding, even without knowing the actual explanation, that a farewell repeated with such total and unwavering dedication across more than 3 decades must carry considerable personal weight for the man delivering it. Durante never explained the phrase's origin in any interview across the following decades, deflecting the question with the same gentle and good-humored evasion whenever it arose, allowing the specific mystery to become, over time, a genuine part of American popular culture. Referenced in other entertainers' material, speculated about extensively in entertainment journalism, and discussed by audiences who had grown up with his broadcasts without ever receiving a definitive answer about who this mysterious woman actually was or why she mattered enough to warrant a farewell repeated across literally thousands of broadcasts spanning more than 3 decades. The specific range of public speculation that developed around this mystery deserves fuller documentation because it reveals exactly how significant a piece of American popular culture the phrase became over the following decades. Entertainment journalists proposed dozens of competing theories over the years, ranging from suggestions that Mrs. Calabash referred to a specific diner or restaurant owner Durante had known during his early vaudeville years, to theories that the name referenced a private joke among his professional circle with no deeper personal significance at all, to considerably more elaborate theories involving various women rumored to have been romantically connected to Durante at different points across his career. Fan clubs and radio audiences organized informal betting pools around the mystery's eventual resolution, and the phrase itself became so culturally embedded that other entertainers occasionally referenced it directly in their own material. Understanding that American audiences would immediately recognize the specific cultural weight the phrase carried, regardless of whether its actual meaning had ever been definitively established. What almost nobody outside Durante's closest circle of friends understood was that this carefully protected mystery concealed a genuine and profound personal grief that Durante had carried privately. For the entirety of his broadcasting career, a grief connected to the death of his first wife, Gene Olsen, in 1943, a loss that fundamentally altered the remainder of his life in ways his public comedic persona never revealed to the audiences who adored him. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens on that stage in a few minutes finally answers one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of American entertainment. Jimmy Durante married Gene Olsen in 1921, when both were young performers working in the same competitive New York entertainment scene, and their marriage, according to accounts given by people who knew them well, was built on a specific and genuine partnership that helped sustain Durante through the considerable uncertainty of building a career in an industry notorious for its instability. The specific circumstances of their meeting deserve fuller documentation, because they illuminate exactly how deeply intertwined their personal and professional lives became from the earliest days of their relationship. Gene worked as a singer in the same competitive New York nightclub circuit where Durante was beginning to establish himself as a comedic performer, and the two met during a shared engagement, developing a rapport that friends said was immediately obvious to everyone who observed them together. A specific ease and mutual understanding that suggested genuine compatibility rather than simply the ordinary professional camaraderie common among performers sharing the same demanding circuit. Their courtship developed relatively quickly, and by the time they married in 1921, both understood clearly that they were embarking on a partnership that would need to accommodate the specific uncertainties and demands of two performing careers simultaneously, a challenge that many similar show business marriages of that era failed to successfully navigate. Gene managed considerable aspects of Durante's early career and personal affairs, and friends described their marriage as a genuine and equal partnership rather than the more traditional arrangement common to that era. Gene bringing a specific business acumen and emotional steadiness that Durante himself credited, in the rare moments he discussed his marriage at all, with providing the foundation that allowed his considerable talent to actually develop into sustained professional success. A foundation without which, Durante privately believed, his considerable natural gifts might never have translated into the sustained decades of professional achievement that eventually followed. Gene Olsen. Durante died in February of 1943, after a period of declining health that Durante rarely discussed publicly, and the loss devastated him in ways that friends said permanently altered his private emotional life even as his public comedic persona continued. across the following decades, projecting the same boundless energy and good humor that had always defined his professional identity. According to one close friend who witnessed Durante's grief directly during this period, he continued performing throughout Gene's final illness and immediately following her death. Understanding that the considerable financial obligations of his career and his professional commitments to the various productions depending on him did not simply pause for private grief, regardless of how genuinely devastating that grief actually was. This friend described watching Durante deliver flawless, boundlessly energetic comedic performances mere days after Jan's funeral, a specific and remarkable demonstration of professional discipline that concealed almost entirely the genuine devastation Durante was privately experiencing. Only in small and largely unnoticed moments, according to this friend, brief pauses backstage between performances, a particular quality of exhaustion in his eyes during quiet moments away from the stage, did the actual scope of his grief become visible to anyone paying sufficiently close attention. According to an account eventually given by one of Durante's closest friends decades later, Durante began using the Mrs. Calabash farewell specifically as a private and coded tribute to Gene, choosing a fictional name rather than her actual name specifically because he wanted the tribute to remain genuinely private, a message that only he and, he hoped, Gene herself, wherever she might be, would fully understand the true meaning of. The specific origin of the name Calabash itself, according to this same account, traced back to a private nickname the couple had developed during their marriage, connected to a small restaurant in Calabash, North Carolina, where they had once shared a particularly meaningful evening early in their relationship. A private reference that meant nothing to anyone outside their marriage, but that Durante clearly hoped would carry, for him personally, the specific weight of everything Gene had meant to him. According to the account eventually given by Durante's close friend, the couple had stopped at this small coastal restaurant during an early touring trip together, before either of them had achieved significant professional success, and had spent an evening there that Durante later described as one of the specific moments when he understood, with genuine clarity, exactly how deeply he had fallen in love with Jen. The restaurant itself was unremarkable by any objective measure, a simple establishment serving fresh seafood to travelers passing through the small coastal town. But the particular quality of connection and ease Durante experienced with Gene during that specific evening transformed an ordinary meal into something he carried as a private touchstone for the remainder of his life, a specific memory he returned to privately whenever he needed to reconnect with the deepest and most genuine feelings he had ever experienced for another person. He never explained this publicly, understanding that doing so would transform a private tribute into public spectacle, and choosing instead to protect the specific privacy of his grief for the remainder of his broadcasting career, delivering the same farewell thousands of times across more than 3 decades, while allowing millions of curious Americans to speculate endlessly about a mystery whose actual answer he alone carried. Johnny Carson had booked Jimmy Durante for that evening's broadcast to discuss his considerable and continuing career, an appearance built entirely around warm, nostalgic reflection on one of the most beloved and longest careers in American entertainment history. Carson himself had a genuine personal fondness for Durante that extended across many years of professional association, having interviewed him on numerous previous occasions and having found him consistently one of the most warmly received guests the show ever hosted, a performer whose considerable age and considerable career longevity gave every one of his appearances a specific and irreplaceable quality of living entertainment history that Carson genuinely valued. Carson had, according to production staff who worked with him closely, privately wondered for years about the actual answer to the Mrs. Calabash mystery, sharing the same genuine curiosity as millions of ordinary American viewers, though he had, in previous interviews with Durante, always respected the older performer's evident wish to keep the subject private rather than pressing for an answer Durante had never seemed ready to provide. Nobody on the production staff had any indication that the broadcast would finally address the specific mystery that had captivated American audiences for over 30 years. The broadcast began exactly as anticipated, Durante performing several minutes of his beloved comedic material with the same boundless energy that had defined his public persona for decades. The studio audience responding with the specific warmth reserved for a performer whose career they had followed in many cases for their entire lives. Several audience members later recalling the particular joy of watching a man in his late 70s perform with an energy that seemed genuinely undiminished by the considerable passage of time since his earliest broadcasts. Roughly 19 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, with the specific curiosity that decades of viewers had shared, but that no previous interviewer had ever successfully satisfied, finally asked Durante directly who Mrs. Calabash actually was. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Jimmy Durante was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his expression. The boundless comedic energy that had defined the broadcast's opening minutes, giving way to something considerably more inward and reflective. A transformation so complete that several audience members later said they briefly wondered whether they were watching the same performer who had, only minutes earlier, delivered his usual boundlessly energetic comedic material. He said that he had been asked this exact question thousands of times across more than 3 decades, and that he had always deflected it, not because he found the question unwelcome, but because the actual answer belonged to a part of his life he had never previously felt ready to share publicly. He described the specific pattern of deflection he had developed over the years, a gentle and consistently good-humored redirection that he had refined into something almost automatic. A practiced response that allowed him to acknowledge the question's genuine curiosity without ever actually approaching the real answer underneath it. He said that this pattern had become so ingrained that he sometimes found himself deflecting the question even in private conversations with close friends who already knew or suspected the actual truth. A specific habit of protection that had extended over the decades beyond simply managing public curiosity into something closer to a genuine and deeply ingrained personal discipline about how he processed his own grief. He said that something about this particular evening, and something about the specific way Carson had asked the question, with genuine curiosity rather than mere professional obligation, had made him feel, for the first time in over 30 years, that perhaps the moment had finally arrived to give America the answer they had been waiting for. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, worn photograph, holding it for a long moment without showing it to anyone, the studio growing quiet as the audience sensed. With the specific attentiveness that builds when a beloved performer's careful public composure begins to shift into something more genuine. Several people present later describing the specific quality of that silence as unlike anything they had experienced during any of Durante's numerous previous appearances on that same stage. He said that Mrs. Calabash had never actually existed, not as a specific person anyone in America could have ever met or recognized, but as a private and coded name for a woman he had loved his entire adult life and had lost far too early, his first wife, Jeanne, who had died in 1943. He held up the photograph, a simple image of a young woman from the early 1920s, and explained, for the first time in any public setting, the specific origin of the name, the private meaning connected to a small restaurant in North Carolina, and the reason he had chosen to protect this tribute in code rather than announcing it directly. He described Gene with a specific and considerable tenderness that several people present said revealed a side of Durante that his boundless public comedic energy had never previously suggested. Speaking about her intelligence, her specific business acumen that had helped guide his early career decisions, and the particular quality of partnership that had made their marriage, in his own assessment, the genuine foundation for everything he subsequently achieved professionally. He said that losing her had been the single most devastating experience of his entire life, considerably more difficult than any professional setback or public disappointment his extensive career had ever produced, and that continuing to perform in the years immediately following her death had required a specific and sustained discipline that he had never previously discussed publicly, choosing instead to let his audiences believe that his boundless comedic energy simply reflected an inherently untroubled temperament rather than the considerable private effort it actually required during those difficult early years of grief. He said that Gene had been an intensely private person who would have found any public spectacle surrounding her memory genuinely uncomfortable, and that using a fictional name allowed him to say goodnight to her. Quite literally, every single time he closed a broadcast, without ever exposing her memory to the kind of public curiosity and speculation that fame inevitably generated. A specific and considered balance between honoring her memory publicly and protecting her privacy that he had maintained with total consistency across more than 3 decades of broadcasting. The studio audience's response to this entire sequence deserves fuller documentation because it reveals how genuinely unprecedented this moment felt to everyone present. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described a specific and unusual quality to the silence that had filled the studio, distinct from the ordinary silence that follows an unexpected or awkward moment in live television. One audience member, a woman who had grown up listening to Durante's radio broadcasts as a child alongside her own parents, told a reporter that she had felt an almost overwhelming sense of finally being trusted with something genuinely significant. As though Durante had chosen that specific evening to finally let an entire generation of loyal listeners into a private corner of his life they had wondered about for their entire lives. Johnny Carson, listening to this account with genuine and evident emotion, asked Durante why he had finally decided, after 30 years of careful protection, to reveal the truth on this particular evening. Durante said that he had recently begun to worry that if he never explained it, the actual meaning would eventually be lost entirely, buried along with him, and that Jean, wherever she might be, deserved to have her memory properly honored rather than remaining forever an unsolved curiosity that history might eventually forget the true significance of. He elaborated further, describing a recent conversation with his own daughter that had specifically prompted this concern. His daughter asking him directly, during a private family gathering, whether he intended to ever reveal the truth about Mrs. Calabash before it became impossible for anyone to know the real story, a question that Durante said had stayed with him in the weeks leading up to this particular broadcast. He said that his daughter's question had made him realize that protecting Jean's privacy indefinitely might eventually mean her actual memory disappeared entirely from public understanding, replaced permanently by whatever speculative theories popular culture ultimately settled on, an outcome he decided in the days before this broadcast he was no longer willing to risk. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of beloved comedic entertainment, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching one of America's most beloved comedic performers reveal, for the first time in over 3 decades, the genuine and profound grief that had quietly shaped every single closing line of his extraordinary career. Several audience members later described feeling a specific privilege in witnessing this revelation, understanding, even as it unfolded, that they were among a genuinely small number of people who had ever been trusted with the actual answer to a mystery that had captivated an entire nation for over 3 decades. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated, Durante discussing, with an openness he had never displayed publicly before, the specific texture of his marriage to Jean, the particular quality of partnership and steadiness she had provided during his early uncertain years, and the specific way that grief, properly honored rather than simply suppressed, could actually coexist with the boundless comedic energy that had defined the remainder of his public career. He spoke about specific memories of their years together that he had never previously shared in any public setting, small domestic details and private jokes that revealed considerably more than any general reflection could have. Exactly how completely he had built his life around their partnership before her death fundamentally altered everything that followed. Carson listened throughout with a quiet respect that several production staff members later specifically praised, understanding with the same instinct that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television, that this particular conversation required considerably less active guidance than simply patient, attentive presence. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most unexpectedly moving unscripted moments in the program's history. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast. Viewers writing and calling specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been, finally learning the answer to a mystery that had captivated American popular culture for over 3 decades, many specifically describing the particular power of learning that the answer had. Always been rooted in genuine love rather than any of the more whimsical or comedic explanations popular. Speculation had generated over the years. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own private grief, describing a particular resonance in learning that Durante had found a way to honor his lost wife publicly, in his own coded way for over 3 decades, without ever compromising the specific privacy he believed her memory deserved. One caller, a widow who had lost her own husband several years earlier, told a production staff member that she had spent years searching for some meaningful way to honor her husband's memory without turning her private grief into public spectacle, and that hearing Durante describe his own solution, a phrase that carried enormous personal meaning while remaining genuinely mysterious to everyone else, gave her a specific and useful model for her own ongoing grief. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific resolution of a beloved entertainment mystery. A broader recognition among American viewers of the many different and equally valid ways that genuine love and genuine grief can be honored across an entire lifetime. In the years following that broadcast, according to people close to him, Durante continued using the Mrs. Calabash farewell in every subsequent performance, a detail several close friends found particularly meaningful given that he could easily have stopped using the phrase now that its true meaning had been publicly revealed. He explained in one later conversation that continuing to use the phrase felt like the most natural way to honor Jean going forward, understanding now that his audiences finally knew who they were actually saying goodnight to alongside him, a specific transformation of the phrase from mystery into shared, collective tribute rather than diminishing its personal significance in any way. Jimmy Durante continued performing for several more years following that broadcast, and according to people close to him, he found the experience of finally speaking Gene's true story publicly genuinely liberating rather than diminishing, describing it, in a later reflection shared with a close friend, as one of the only truly significant moments of genuine catharsis he experienced across his entire extensive career. He died on January 29, 1980, 8 years after that broadcast, and his obituaries across American media specifically referenced the Mrs. Calabash mystery and its eventual resolution as one of the most beloved and most genuinely touching stories connected to his remarkable life. Several of these obituaries specifically noted that Durante's final years, having finally spoken his private tribute aloud, seemed to carry a specific and visible piece that friends said had not always characterized his earlier decades of quietly protected grief. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Durante's career back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years after his death, when broadcasting historians and biographers began examining the full scope of his extraordinary and unusually long career for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified the Mrs. Calabash mystery and its eventual resolution as one of the most genuinely significant and most emotionally resonant moments in the entire history of American broadcasting, precisely because it demonstrated something audiences rarely had the opportunity to witness directly: the specific and considerable private grief that so often exists underneath the boundless public energy of beloved comedic performers. One broadcasting historian, in a documentary examining the golden age of American radio and television comedy, noted that Durante's decades of quiet, coded tribute represented one of the purest examples available of genuine love expressed through sustained public ritual. A private message delivered thousands of times to an audience of millions who had no idea, until that Tonight Show broadcast, exactly who they were actually saying goodnight to alongside him. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the private tributes and private grief that the people in your own life might be carrying quietly, protected behind humor or routine or careful public composure, waiting for the right moment and the right question to finally be spoken aloud. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that even the most beloved public mysteries often conceal genuine and profound love rather than simple curiosity. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when America's most beloved entertainers finally revealed the truth behind their most enduring mysteries. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a private tribute in your own life that you have never fully explained to anyone.